There is one painful truth that a narcissistic person will almost never admit to you. It is a reality they may spend years hiding behind charm, sudden anger, carefully planned silence, and emotional displays that seem to appear only when they serve a certain purpose. And here is what makes that truth so important. They are not necessarily most afraid of your anger. They are not truly shaken simply because you cry, become upset, or threaten to leave. They may have experienced those reactions many times before. So what actually disrupts their sense of control? What can make the entire pattern suddenly feel unstable? It is the moment you stop reacting to them. It is the moment you finally begin seeing the behavior clearly instead of seeing the person you hoped they would become. It is when your eyes stop looking for their approval and start observing their actions without emotional attachment. Because in that exact moment, something they may have depended on for a long time begins to weaken. The illusion starts to crack. The cycle of manipulation, control, and emotional pressure loses its fuel when you stop feeding it with fear, anger, explanations, or desperate attempts to be understood. Suddenly, they are facing someone who is no longer responding in the way they expected. And that can be when their behavior becomes noticeably different. Once you understand these patterns, you may begin to recognize something that many people struggle to see for years. The person creating the most emotional pressure may not have as much power as they appear to have. Their influence can depend heavily on how much emotional energy you give them. They may work extremely hard to make you believe that they control the entire relationship, while the real turning point begins when you realize that you still have control over your own attention, boundaries, and responses. Before we continue, take a moment to do something supportive for yourself. If you have ever felt manipulated, constantly questioned your own memory, or become emotionally drained by someone who claimed to care about you, consider following this channel if this message speaks to your experience, not for anyone else. For your own awareness and growth, because what comes next may change the way you understand controlling behavior and the patterns that often surround it. Many people do not realize that a person with strong narcissistic traits may not operate primarily through healthy connection or mutual understanding. Control can become central to the relationship. It can become the thing that temporarily reduces their insecurity and gives them a sense of importance or emotional stability. And one way that control can develop is through carefully observing another person. They may pay close attention to your fears, your hopes, your insecurities, your previous disappointments, your loneliness, and your desire to finally feel understood. Then they may present themselves as the answer to everything you have been missing. This can help explain why the beginning of such a relationship may feel incredibly powerful. The connection can seem almost perfect. The attention feels intense. The understanding feels unusually deep. But sometimes what looks like extraordinary emotional connection can also involve someone learning exactly what makes you vulnerable. They are discovering your emotional landscape, learning what affects you, what comforts you, what scares you, and what makes you stay. Later, that knowledge can be used in unhealthy ways. And when you begin to heal, when you start rebuilding your confidence, and when you slowly reconnect with the person you were before the relationship, the old pattern may stop working as effectively. The emotional map they once relied on becomes less useful because you are no longer responding from the same place. That is when their behavior may begin changing in ways that feel confusing or even disturbing. Pay very close attention to this part because it can reveal the pattern more clearly than their words ever will. When a controlling person senses that their influence is weakening, they may not respond with calm self-reflection. Instead, they may react with anxiety disguised as anger, confidence, or superiority. They might suddenly become extremely cold. Then, without warning, they may become incredibly affectionate and attentive. They could disappear without giving you a clear explanation, only to return later with overwhelming attention. They may create arguments over small things. They might bring up painful events from the past that you thought were already finished. They may accuse you of actions you never committed or tell a completely different version of something that happened. Sometimes they may attempt to make you question your own memory or interpretation of events. The goal may not always be conscious, but the effect can be the same. You become confused, defensive, and emotionally focused on proving yourself instead of observing the larger pattern. They expect you to react. They expect you to explain. They expect you to become emotional and return to the role that feels familiar to them. But something changes when you refuse to collapse into that role. When you remain calm, stay grounded, and stop endlessly defending yourself, the dynamic can begin to shift. Their attempts to provoke you may no longer produce the same result, and that can feel deeply unsettling to someone who has become accustomed to controlling the emotional temperature of the relationship. This is the part that is rarely discussed. A person who appears extremely powerful on the outside may still be carrying deep insecurity underneath the surface. The confidence can be real in some moments, but it can also function as protection. The superiority can hide vulnerability, the aggression can cover fear, and the constant need for control can sometimes reveal just how uncomfortable they are with feeling powerless. That does not excuse harmful behavior. Understanding the pattern does not mean accepting it. It simply helps you recognize what you are looking at without becoming trapped inside the emotional performance. And once you can observe the behavior without automatically reacting to it, the entire dynamic can begin to look very different. Behind the arrogance, the harsh behavior, and that cold, distant image, there may be a deeply insecure part of the person that never learned how to feel safe within themselves. That insecurity can help explain why some people with strong narcissistic traits develop such a powerful need to control the people around them. They may need constant praise. They may need to feel important, admired, feared, or obeyed. They may struggle intensely when someone questions them or refuses to accept their version of reality. And when a person who has done serious inner work, someone who has started recognizing their own value, enters their life and refuses to lower themselves, the reaction can become intense. Suddenly they are confronted with something they have spent years avoiding: their own insecurity, their own emptiness, their own painful sense that they are not as powerful as they have tried to appear. And what happens next can reveal far more than any words ever could. One of the first signs that a controlling person may be losing influence over you is sudden, disproportionate anger. This is not the kind of anger that naturally fits the situation. It can appear over something incredibly small and seem completely out of proportion to what actually happened. Maybe you used a different tone of voice. Maybe you took longer than expected to answer a message. Maybe you calmly established a boundary. Maybe you simply did not laugh at something they said. Suddenly, the emotional reaction becomes enormous. And often the real issue is not the small event itself. The deeper issue may be that you did not respond in the familiar way they expected. You did not become frightened. You did not immediately apologize. You did not surrender your boundary. You did not provide the emotional reaction they were used to receiving from you. And when their usual methods stop producing the desired response, they may escalate. If charm no longer works, they may try pressure. If pressure fails, they may move toward intimidation. And if intimidation still does not restore the old dynamic, they may attempt to damage the relationship itself or create emotional chaos around you. The second sign is sudden withdrawal. This can look like the silent treatment, refusing to speak, becoming emotionally cold, disappearing for hours or days, or sitting near you while acting as if you are not even there. From the outside, this may look like simple indifference, but sometimes withdrawal is not about being calm at all. It can be used as a form of punishment or control. The message becomes, "You will feel my absence until you give me the response I want." The intention may be to make you feel invisible, abandoned, anxious, or desperate enough to reach out first. It can test whether an old emotional wound is still active inside you. Do you still fear being rejected? Do you still feel you must prove that you deserve love? Do you still believe you have to chase someone before they leave you completely? If those fears once controlled your behavior, their silence may have been enough to pull you back immediately. But when you remain grounded, refuse to beg for attention, and stop desperately trying to repair every silence they create, something important changes. You show that their absence does not automatically destroy your emotional stability. You show that you can remain whole even when they withdraw. And that can be extremely threatening to a dynamic built around control. But the next pattern can be even more confusing. The third sign is blame shifting, and sometimes it can become almost theatrical. Suddenly, every problem is somehow your responsibility. Their angry words become your fault because you supposedly pushed them too far. Their lies become something you caused because you were not trusting enough. Their betrayal becomes your responsibility because you supposedly failed to love them correctly. Their behavior is constantly explained by something you did. This is not a healthy disagreement where two people honestly examine their mistakes. It becomes a way of moving responsibility away from themselves and placing it entirely onto you. The goal may be to bring back the guilt and self-doubt that once kept you emotionally trapped. If you constantly question yourself, you become easier to control. If you keep wondering whether everything was somehow your fault, you spend less time examining their behavior. But when you stop accepting that responsibility, the dynamic changes again. You begin recognizing the difference between something you genuinely need to take responsibility for and something that has simply been placed on your shoulders, and that distinction can give you enormous freedom. The fourth sign is the smear campaign. When direct manipulation stops working, some controlling people may take the conflict outside the relationship. They begin telling friends, relatives, co-workers, or other people in your social circle a carefully edited version of what happened. Suddenly, you are described as unstable, selfish, cruel, cold, difficult, or ungrateful. They may present themselves as the wounded person while leaving out the parts that would change the story. And because they may tell the story with confidence and emotion, people who have never witnessed the private behavior can become confused. Some may even begin questioning your character. This can feel devastating. But understand what may be happening beneath the surface. A smear campaign can function as an attempt to control the narrative and rebuild the social pressure that once kept you compliant. If everyone around you believes that you are the problem, you may begin doubting yourself too. You may start thinking, what if they are right? What if I really am the difficult one? And that is where the cycle can regain its strength. But you do not have to accept someone else's version of you simply because they repeat it loudly. Your responsibility is not to convince every person in the world of your innocence. Your responsibility is to remain connected to reality, your values, your boundaries, and the evidence of your own experience. If any of this feels familiar, take a moment and stay with this message, because the next part may explain why becoming emotionally independent can change the entire dynamic. You do not need to become cruel. You do not need revenge. You do not need to destroy anyone. You simply need to stop handing someone else the power to determine your emotional state. Because when your peace no longer depends on their approval, their anger, their silence, or their attempts to rewrite the story, their ability to control you becomes dramatically weaker. And that is something a controlling person may find extremely difficult to accept. Emotional independence is not about becoming heartless. It is about becoming free. It is not money. It is not social status. It is not even the direct possibility that you might walk away. The real turning point is emotional independence. The moment you stop needing their approval, their praise, their attention, or their permission to feel good about yourself, you begin disconnecting from the source of control they once had over you. And when a person who depends heavily on control can no longer get the same emotional reaction from you, their behavior may become increasingly unstable. That is why some controlling and narcissistic people can become more aggressive when they notice that you are healing instead of becoming calmer. From their perspective, Your recovery can feel like losing access to something they once relied upon. Your peace becomes something they cannot disturb as easily. Your growing self-respect becomes a barrier they cannot simply walk through. They may not actually want you to become stronger because strength makes you harder to manipulate. They may prefer you dependent, uncertain, and constantly reacting to whatever they say or do. The healthier you become, the less effective their old methods can become, and that can make the relationship dynamic change dramatically. Pay attention to this because it is one of the most important parts of understanding the cycle. Boundaries are not necessarily walls designed to punish someone. Healthy boundaries are more like clear lines that reveal where you end and another person begins. They make the relationship visible. And when someone is used to having unlimited access to your time, emotions, attention, or decisions, those boundaries can feel extremely uncomfortable. Every time you calmly say no, every time you refuse to participate in an argument, every time you decide that disrespect will no longer be accepted, you are showing them something they may not want to face. You are a separate person. You have your own mind, your own values, your own identity, and your own life. You existed before them, and you can continue existing without allowing them to control your choices. That reality can be especially difficult for someone who has become accustomed to treating another person's attention as something they are entitled to. In an unhealthy dynamic, you may gradually become less like an equal person and more like a source of reassurance, admiration, emotional comfort, or validation. The relationship becomes centered around what you provide rather than who you are. And when that pattern suddenly changes, they may experience it as rejection or betrayal, even though you are simply reclaiming parts of yourself that were never theirs to control. You are not stealing anything from them. You are taking back responsibility for your own life. You are returning to yourself. And that is something manipulation cannot permanently take away once you truly understand it. This is also why boundaries can sometimes trigger intense reactions. To someone who expects constant access, a simple boundary can feel like an attack. Your refusal to argue may feel like disrespect to them. Your decision to leave a conversation may feel like abandonment. Your choice to stop explaining yourself may feel like a loss of control. But remember this, you do not have to convince someone to respect your boundary before you are allowed to have one. A boundary does not require their agreement. It requires your consistency. And there is another part of this pattern that people often overlook. Beneath the insults, the silent treatment, the guilt, the lies, the blame, and the sudden anger, there can be a powerful emotion driving the behavior: fear. A person with strong narcissistic defenses may carry deep fears of rejection, exposure, failure, abandonment, or feeling insignificant. They may fear being seen without the image they have carefully created. They may fear discovering that the identity they worked so hard to protect does not feel as solid as it appears. And instead of facing those painful emotions directly, they may push them outward. They may provoke someone else into feeling the anxiety they cannot tolerate inside themselves. They may create conflict so that the focus remains on you instead of on their own behavior. For a long time, you may have carried that emotional burden without even realizing it. You became the one apologizing. You became the one explaining. You became the one trying to calm everything down. You became the one wondering what you had done wrong, and this is why your healing can feel so threatening to the old dynamic. The moment you stop carrying emotions that never belonged to you, the other person has to face more of their own feelings. That can be uncomfortable, sometimes extremely uncomfortable. But it is not your responsibility to protect someone from the consequences of their own behavior. And once you understand that, their actions begin to look different. Their rage no longer automatically looks like strength. It can look like emotional dysregulation or panic. Their silence may no longer look like confidence or superiority. It may simply be an unhealthy attempt to punish, control, or avoid the situation. Their blame shifting is not proof that they are right. It may be a way of escaping responsibility. Their smear campaign does not automatically prove that everyone believes them. It may simply show how badly they want control over the story. Suddenly, the person who once seemed enormous and untouchable can begin to look much more human. Not harmless, not excused, but human. Someone whose outward confidence may be covering deep insecurity and fear. And once you recognize the pattern clearly, it becomes much harder for that pattern to control you in the same way. But there is an even deeper truth here. Sometimes the greatest threat to a controlling person is not simply that you leave, it is that you become someone they no longer know how to manipulate. The version of you they were comfortable with may have been the version that constantly needed their approval, the version that questioned itself, the version that apologized too quickly, the version that gave endless chances, the version that accepted less than it deserved because it was afraid of losing the relationship. But then something changes. You begin remembering your value. You stop explaining every decision. You speak clearly. You establish limits without feeling ashamed. You stop confusing chaos with passion. You choose peace even when someone tries to pull you back into conflict. And suddenly the person standing in front of them is different. They may still recognize your face, but the old emotional access is gone. The old wounds no longer respond in the same way. The old buttons no longer work as easily. That is the real transformation. You do not become impossible to hurt. You become much harder to control, and that difference can change everything. Because the strongest version of you is not the version that defeats another person. It is the version that no longer needs to defeat anyone at all. You simply stop participating in the cycle. You stop handing your peace to someone else. You stop allowing another person's reactions to determine your worth. And when you reach that point, the old version of the relationship has nowhere left to stand. The person you are becoming has changed the entire pattern, and the person who once knew exactly how to trigger you may no longer understand how to reach you. That is why your healing can become one of the strongest challenges to a controlling and narcissistic dynamic. It is not about revenge. It is not about exposing every secret. It is not even about proving that you were right or making someone regret losing you. It is about becoming healthy again. Revenge can be twisted into a story about your anger. Exposure can be turned into a story about your bitterness. Even your decision to leave can be presented as evidence that you were the cruel one. But genuine healing is much harder to manipulate. It does not need an argument. It does not need an audience. It does not need approval. A healed person becomes difficult to pull back into the same emotional cycle because they no longer feel the need to participate in it. They do not chase every explanation. They do not beg for understanding. They do not constantly defend themselves. They do not perform their pain just to prove that it was real. They simply begin living again, quietly, steadily, fully, and that peaceful life can reveal something powerful. You can build a life without the chaos that once seemed impossible to escape. You can wake up without checking someone else's mood. You can make decisions without wondering how they will react. You can enjoy your own company without feeling guilty. You can experience peace without needing permission. And for someone who depended on emotional control, watching you move forward can be deeply uncomfortable because your life is no longer organized around them. Pay attention to this part because it can change the way you understand your own recovery. Self-respect may be the quietest strength you will ever develop, but it can also become one of the strongest protections you have. I am not talking about loud confidence or constantly announcing your worth. Real self-respect is much quieter. It is the inner decision that you will no longer betray yourself simply to keep another person comfortable. It is the ability to say no without writing a 5-page explanation afterward. It is the ability to leave a conversation when it becomes disrespectful. It is the ability to hear criticism without immediately assuming that you must be wrong. When you genuinely respect yourself, manipulation has far less room to work. Guilt trips become easier to recognize. Gaslighting becomes less powerful because you learn to check reality instead of automatically accepting someone else's version. Flattery no longer controls you because you do not need another person's praise to know that you have value. Threats become less frightening because you begin understanding that losing a harmful relationship can sometimes be safer than losing yourself inside it. Self-respect does not make you unreachable because you stop caring. It makes you harder to control because you finally care about yourself too. And there is something else you need to understand. Being manipulated does not automatically mean that you were weak. You may have been trusting. You may have believed what someone told you. You may have wanted to see the best in them. You may have stayed because you cared, because you hoped things would change, or because you believed the relationship could return to the way it felt in the beginning.